Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. Kim, I wonder what your take on this research question is, and maybe this fusion experiment is an opportunity to shift some of that money back where it really belongs. I mean, a lot of the funds that Congress and President Biden have been pushing into green programs have gone to things like subsidies, tax credits for electric vehicles. A lot of those get eaten up by people who are relatively well off in the first place, living in coastal areas, buying Teslas. And I mean, maybe there's an argument that that money ought to be spent on more basic research for fundamental technologies that could change the argument about climate, like this could, even if it's decades out yet.
My problem is that how do we put the genie back in the bottle? And that leads me to be even a little bit more skeptical than even Alicia on basic research for this reason, which is, I mean, here we are, as Alicia just laid out, we just had the Inflation Reduction Act, which was crammed full of subsidies and different money for essentially the government picking winners and losers and funding private ventures, as it were. And the remarkable thing to me is, again, I'm old enough to remember Barack Obama's stimulus, where we also earmarked a bunch of money for this kind of business to phenomenal failure. That's why the word Solyndra became a joke in terms of government investment. We don't do it well. And yet here we are doing it again, despite all the evidence that it doesn't work. And the problem that we have in Washington is the appetite for research dollars and grants is never ending. And it rarely does stay restrained to basic research. I know that the argument has long been that this is government's job, but I do actually increasingly question that a little bit, in that a long time ago in the U.S. economy, there wasn't as much of an interest in the private sector in science, as it were. But now there is an enormous amount of interest, whether it's from the energy sector or the tech sector or the biologic sector, health sector. You know, right now, our private sector spends, I think, 8 times as much on research and development than the government does. And you would have some people who would say, well, that just is an argument for why we need more government dollars. No, I would argue that that shows that the research and development side out in corporate America is alive and thriving. And maybe the fact that we still make this argument that, oh, it's government's job to do basic research, maybe it's getting in the way of people who would do it even better in the private sector. And I think that's at least something worth contemplating.
Well, we're on the subject of these electric vehicles and the subsidies, the distorting effect they have on markets. Alicia, there's some news that I know you've looked at out of Illinois and a Cherokee plant there. What's going on?
So the company Stellantis, which was formed through a merger with the PSA Group, France's, and the U.S.-Italian conglomerate Fiat Chrysler, has announced that they are going to shut down Jeep Cherokee plant come February that currently employs about 1,300 workers. And in its announcement last week, it cited the expense of the shift toward electric vehicles. What it obviously didn't say is that the government is driving this shift, both subsidies and mandates. Fiat Chrysler, or the company now Stellantis, has actually been lagging the industry in general toward the EVs. But now the Biden administration in Europe, too, Europe has now proposed banning internal combustion engines come 2035, and a number of U.S. states have. But even aside from that, the Biden fuel economy rules essentially mandate that automakers increase the share of EVs. This is kind of an EV mandate through the back door. In the past, the company has been buying regulatory credits to comply with this mandate because it has actually been producing fewer EVs than other automakers, and it has mainly bought these credits from Tesla. And so it's basically subsidizing its competitor, and that's not really a sustainable business model going forward if these EV mandates continue to ratchet up. And so what it's doing now is shutting down this plant, which will probably be rendered obsolescent due to these mandates and the bans, and shifting more company resources, capital, more than $30 billion it says it plans to spend on EVs over the next 3 years, and shifting that money to the EVs. And currently, what's interesting is that drivers of so-called gas guzzlers are subsidizing EV drivers because they're the ones that are throwing off the profits, especially SUV and trucks, which are making up a larger share of the vehicle mix. And right now, a lot of the automakers are selling their EVs at a loss. And their goal is they hope is that if they could just produce the EVs at larger scale, and with the subsidies and the Inflation Reduction Act, they may be able to actually make a profit in several years on these cars. I think actually GM went out and said that they expect the subsidies in the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, to increase their profits per vehicle by around $3,500 to $5,500. And that's pretty substantial. So some workers are maybe gaining jobs in places like Ohio and Kentucky working on battery factories. There are also a lot of jobs that are going to be lost in this quote-unquote EV transition, and the politicians never want to talk about those.
Meanwhile, Kim, Europe is moving forward, pushing ahead with a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which they call it. And it's basically a tax because there are green emissions credits. There's a system in place in Europe. And the concern is that things that used to operate in Europe are going to go out of Europe to avoid that. The dirty stuff will be pushed abroad. And so now they're talking about taxing things at the border when they come in order to prevent that from happening or at least adjust for it. And Kim, I mean, I'm just concerned. I understand the economists' argument that the way to deal with these kinds of things is something like a straight carbon tax because it is the least distorting on the economy. And obviously there are reasons that is politically unpalatable. It's been rejected in many places, including a few U.S. states. But the alternative is these policies that politicians are trying to advance in lieu of that, which are similar but through other means. And I worry end up more distorting the economy, and you end up in a place where companies are adjusting and winning and losing based on their ability to make the best use of these complicated rules and not the real fundamentals of competing in the market.
Well, this is exactly what is happening in Europe. What you're seeing with this carbon border adjustment mechanism is a tax that in essence is trying to deal with the fallout from another tax, in that what they have done is set up this complicated system for emissions rules within the EU, which is strangling their own industries. So then the question is, do you get this stuff and import it in? Do European manufacturers begin to move offshore so that they're not subject to this? So now you have to put up this tax wall at the border to make sure that your internal mechanism is still working and is effective. It's a terrible, as you say, distortionary way to go about anything. It's a big blow to a global economy because this has the ability to come back and hit anyone who imports into Europe, including U.S. manufacturers and Asian manufacturers. It was quite shocking that they did it too, because it's increasing friction with the United States, especially in addition to the fact that Europe decided to go ahead recently and pose this 15% minimum corporate tax after one of their last holdouts, Hungary, agreed to go along. This is another way of ensuring that there cannot be any tax competition within the EU, but in a desire to make sure that no one else benefits, there's now a real possibility that U.S. companies are going to be double taxed on some of their income. This is a means of a little bit of a tax war. So boo on Europe for a bunch of very bad tax provisions. Again, all of them stemming from a kind of badly thought out climate agenda.
Thank you, Kim and Alicia. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.